The stream is about to begin.
All right, my rated Ivy Wright pupils, we got an interesting commencement address that we're going to take a look at today. Kermit the Frog's 2025 commencement address to the University of Maryland graduates. It's fantastic, just rife for rhetorical analysis. So in this video, we're going to break down that particular text, and I'm going to do a writing workshop to show you how my students would write this essay using my heuristics. So those that are familiar with my work know that for rhetorical analysis, my students always use a frame or a scaffold called the declarative thesis. And then for the body paragraphs, they use an Aristotelian heuristic called the syllogistic method. So from start to finish in the video, you'll see the essay just pop and come alive right in front of your eyes. We're going to construct it from top to bottom. So I wrote these examples. They're mine. They're not my students. So they should be pretty good and kind of edifying in terms of how to tackle this particular piece. So one of the reasons I made this video is that I'm in a district where there's rampant cheating. There's a black market of kids selling essays from one grade level to the next. So I'm always creating new content each year. It keeps, my teaching young and fresh and exciting, and it keeps me on my game. So if there's anything that you think would be an interesting rhetorical analysis piece, drop me an email and let me know, and I'll check it out, and maybe I'll make something for all of us. So sit in, strap up, and let's take a look at Kermit the Frog's commencement address. All right, my rated Ivy Wright friends. So since this is going to be the first rhetorical analysis to kick off the 2025-2026 academic year, I want to keep my prompts really basic and not throw any curveballs at my inexperienced students. So this is very just sort of tepid vanilla prompt, straightforward. So here it is. The following is a passage from America's favorite amphibious character, Kermit the Frog, as he delivers the commencement address to the 2025 graduating class at the University of Maryland. Read the passage carefully. Write an essay that analyzes the rhetorical choices Kermit makes to develop his address to the attendees of the ceremony. So clearly that's really basic. Like, we're just going to do a nuts and bolts rhetorical analysis, no trickeration at all. So the very first thing we need to ask ourselves is this. So how do I write the intro? So at this stage of the game, the students and I have unpacked the text. Since it's the first one of the year, I tend to do a lot of spoon feeding with it just because of their inexperience, but that's all fine and good. So the question becomes, how do I write the intro? For those that are familiar with my work, you know that for rhetorical analysis, we always use the declarative thesis heuristic. And in that heuristic, there are two implicit questions, right? If you go back to antiquity as far as the AP language exam goes and take a look at rhetorical analysis prompts, a dirty little secret is that every single one of them has these two questions implicit in the language. The first is, how does the author construct meaning? And when you answer that question, you're going to use your rhetorical terms, devices, and techniques. And the second question is, what is the author's intent? Another way of saying that is like universal theme or exigence. So cloak it in whatever language is familiar with your students. You'll observe that there's a 3 in front of the first question and a 1 in front of the second question. Here's my meaning behind that. The first 3 sentences of the introductory paragraph are going to riff on the question, how does the author construct meaning? One sentence is going to go the route of, what is the author's intent? So whether or not we're doing literary analysis or rhetorical analysis, I always tell my students that we're going to use the 3+1. So let's visually take a look at what a declarative thesis heuristic looks like. There are certain ingredients that I like to see in it. One is, given that we have an academic audience, a little bit of tier 2 level vocabulary. So mind you, this is going to be the first rhetorical analysis of the year. So I always tell kids when I introduce my Word Study Academy to them, where I want them to augment their vocab like exponentially over the course of the academic year, I always have to disabuse certain students of the following. Using $1 million words is not impressive writing. In fact, it's actually bad writing. So I want them to stretch their vocabs, but stay in their wheelhouse, especially since we haven't done too many vocabulary exercises at this stage of the game. The other thing is sentence constructs. I started teaching this very early in the year with my Nuanced Academy. And at come time of writing this, students will have had exposure to Strunk & White's Write It Right. It's the manual that we use for the course. And they have something called rule number 18, in which they espouse that there's 12 different sentence types, which means that if you were to write me an independent clause as an example, I could rewrite it just by manipulating the syntax, basically say the exact same thing, but do it through 11 different sentence types. So it's really important for voice rhythm and flow that the students know the 12 sentence types. And then later on in the year, I'll get them into the 20 sentence patterns. And I have a bunch of stuff in my YouTube channel about that if you want to do a deep dive. So you do need to provide a little bit of context and background without getting overly plot summative. And since we call it declarative, you are going to declare or begin with the thesis. And it's always going to be 4 sentences long, right? 3 sentences for that first question, 1 sentence for the second question. So I always, especially early in the academic year, Bob Ross my instruction and make sure that my teaching is really explicit and that the kids know exactly what expectations are as far as writing goes. So as I said earlier, all the exemplars and models that you're going to see forthcoming, I wrote them. And I'm just going to kind of open up the lid of my brain and say, hey, kids, there are heuristics. Just like Bob Ross used the wet on wet technique every time he did a natural landscape. When we do composition, we can always declare or invert the thesis, and all body paragraphs can be done syllogistically. Like, that's going to mean nothing to them unless I get to the easel and canvas and air quote paint with and for them. So all these exemplars are mine. It's a really good practice, probably the best practice when teachers actually write in front of their students. I've found that it completely demystifies the writing process for students. So enough of my talking into the ether. Let's paint a few and see what it looks like. So this is exemplar number 1. I'll read it top to bottom, and then I'll unpack it for you and show all the ingredients that I put in here. So here it is. Staying true to the essence of his caricature, Kermit the Frog sticks to the common motifs of what a commencement address is intended to do. Opine a bit of life wisdom. Replete with frog puns and not so subtle side jokes, his advice is laced with the levity that belies his innocence. Enumerating 3 key points, he lightheartedly gives the graduating class a few pearls of wisdom. To hold true to his persona, Kermit employs numerous discourse markers to advance his ethos. So you can see in here, right, that there are a number of terms and devices either explicitly stated or implicitly stated. So we know that we were going to have 3 sentences that tackle the construction of meaning, and you lead with that, right? Because the terms, the devices, techniques pretty much dictate the thesis. So this first sentence here, staying true to the essence of his caricature, we're getting rooted in ethos. Kermit the Frog sticks to the common motifs of what a commencement address is intended to do. Opine a bit of life wisdom, right? So we're into the theme, we're into the ethos. So you want to see a few terms, devices, techniques in here because in isolation, they don't comprise the meaning of the piece. So students want to focus on the most germane, most salient terms, devices, techniques in the thesis. So replete with frog puns. So there's one. And not so subtle side jokes, right? The humor, the pathos. His advice is laced with a levity that belies his innocence. And we're kind of touching upon tone there a little bit. And then enumeration is something that is used in this commencement address, which is part of a typical motif for commencement address. So enumeration, we got that. 3 points. He lightheartedly gives the graduating class a few pearls of wisdom. To hold true to his persona, again, lots of ethos in here, Kermit employs numerous discourse markers. So one of the things I noted in this speech is there's a lot of, like, I know I have a speech impediment. I stutter a lot and I say, you know. Those are discourse markers. So he says, yeah, wow, yeah, oh, wow. Like, to begin, virtually 1 out of 3 of the sentences, he uses those discourse markers. So I think that is really important because it ties into his ethos in terms of establishing that childhood innocence, right? He's a childhood character. So you can see there that that is quintessential 3+1 declarative thesis heuristic. Might be a little nebulous, pie in the sky, so let's paint another one and take a look at sample number 2. We're going to use the same heuristic. Never strain from his well-established role as a beloved children's character, Kermit delivers his message beneath the umbrella of several frog puns and allusions to the quippy nature of an amphibian's life trajectory. Paralleling his life experiences to those of the graduating class, he enumerates 3 common dictums that everyone should adhere to in order to achieve success on the path that lies ahead of each individual at the ceremony. Embodying the essence of his inner child, Kermit's diction often emerges from a place of incipiency, which deviates from the typical discourse modes of such an address. Humorous and lighthearted, his endearing remarks prove that his amphibious adventures closely mirror the journey these graduates are soon to embark upon. So you can see here in this one as well, I'm not going to unpack it like I did the first one for time's sake, but you can see that there's a blend of implicit and explicit. And that's something I really want my students to know early in the year, is that you don't have to be explicit. And, oftentimes students will say ethos, pathos, logos, and it's like, yeah, use synonyms, right? Because you want to be as conversational as possible. And, I usually don't go up to people and say, I object to your pathos, your saccharine lies. So we tend to use other verbiage to get around ethos, pathos, logos. Some of them you do need to express explicitly, like this one uses enumeration again. And then to get to those discourse markers, I said diction often emerges from a place of incipiency, right? So you can always use synonyms and your reader will be well aware of what you're talking about, if your language is precise in terms of the implication. So this one's 3+1 as well. Let's talk about something that I didn't in the first, sentence constructs. You can go back to the first later on and see what I mean, but we'll look at number 2 here just to identify what I'm talking about. So if you read sentence number 1, you can see that it's kind of long and it's got that middle comma in there. When you get to sentence number 2, you got to go back to number 1 and say, I don't want to parallel that sentence. I need a different construct. And you can see that number 2 is different. 3 is different than 2. 4 is different than 3. It's called parallel syntax. Students often do this. And especially the writers that we read over the course of the year, they do it all the time, but they do it for an effect. They have a purpose behind it. Usually it belies that a struggling, emerging writer is coming of age, and they typically slap down a lot of independent clauses and just go independent clause, adjective clause, independent clause. And it yields a droning rhythm that sounds like da-da, 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 da-da. And that is why I teach those 12 sentence types in the 20 sentence pattern so much. You can also see that there's a fair amount of tier 2 level vocabulary. And I know that some of you are going to say, Kristian, there's no way my kids can do this. This is absurd. You can't expect kids to do this. You got to keep this in mind. Bob Ross always said, I will not dumb down my instruction, because students can always approximate what I'm doing to the best of their abilities. And I think in order to have a classroom of good writers, they need to see a lot of good writing. So one of the things I do as the year progresses is I always celebrate students who are crushing the writing task. And I will make little Canvas slides like this and present them on the overhead and dissect them, because the students who are struggling or emerging a little bit can look at that and approximate it, and that's how you get growth, right? That's how you exact change. So I'm not a big fan of like loading students' papers with a bunch of comments. That usually doesn't yield much growth or maturation, but writing workshops of this caliber tend to do the trick. All right, I got 3 exemplars for you. So let's roll the brush one more time and take a look at sample number 3. Again, it's going to go 3 plus 1. Staying true to the ethos of his creator, Staying true to the ethos his creator bestowed upon him, Kermit addresses the graduating class with something closely akin to dad jokes, frog jokes, to draw the parallels between his life adventures and the path that lies ahead of them. So the essential juxtaposition between himself and the graduating class, it's implied. Punctuating his address with 3 key points, so that would be the enumeration. You could, again, use synonyms. He implores the student body to embrace their inner frog nature and leap, pun intended, into life with a certain sense of zeal and smarts. Riddling his remarks with the discourse markers of youthful innocence, he breaks convention to remain true to the essence of his long-established persona. So I'm all about ethos in here. Witty and humorous, so you could touch upon the tone. Kermit proves the point. The trail he has blazed mirrors the journey these graduates are about to embark upon. All they need to do is follow his lead. So again, it's always 3 plus 1. So all day long, students can do this for rhetorical analysis. And I know that some of you might say it's going to take kids forever to learn this. Yes, it is slow. So I get my kids the day after Labor Day, and the first couple of essays we write, we labor over them class after class after class. But if you're consistent and ask kids to use these heuristics over the course of an academic year, they could do it easy peasy. So you know that for Lang, obviously you have 3 essays to write in 2 hours. Very seldom do I have students come back from the exam saying, I didn't finish. I wasn't able. Every year I do get, an occasional kid who's a super slow eker, and there's not much I can do to speed them up. But using heuristics, I think, actually speeds up the process, and it takes the guessing game out of the equation. So intros are done. We got to ask ourselves the question, and how about the bodies? As I've already alluded to, we're going to use something called the syllogistic method. It comes from Aristotle. So Aristotle ran a school called the Lyceum, and the townsboys would go there to learn about polemics, oration, debate, wordsmithing, word wrangling. And they'd often throw out these juicy, pithy, essential questions like, what is justice? And some of you might say, that's the essential question of the seminal text, Plato's Republic. Yes, you are right. And the think tankers and the scholars and the philosophers would step to the proverbial mic and boom, drop their definition of what justice is. And Aristotle, like us composition teachers, noted that some students had real alacrity with this, real skill, and other kids struggled with it. And he's like, I wonder what the good students are doing. I wonder if I can open up the lid of their brain and kind of get a look at their inner machinations and figure out like some formula or something. And one day, like Eureka, he said, I got it. The really good orators are using something called the syllogistic method. And this is what he trademarked. Syllogism is basically when you're going premise 1, premise 2, conclusion. And we know when we study ethos, pathos, and logos, when you get into logos, you have to be studying syllogism. So you're kind of doing 2 birds, 1 stone here. A syllogism, right, is a logos bubble. It's a logos structure. So if I were to say to you, arsenic is deadly in the first premise, you'd all nod your head and say, yup, Kristian, you are 100% correct. But in my second premise, if I bring in the following textual support, you're going to have a natural conclusion that you're going to draw. So if I say, this morning, I walked into the kitchen to make a cup of coffee, and there's pickle at the kitchen sink. And just the night before, I loaded that kitchen cupboard beneath the sink with a whole bunch of arsenic because we have a rat infestation problem. And I said, pickle! And he pulls his head out of the cupboard, and there's white powder all over his scruff and muff and grizzle, right? You're naturally going to conclude, uh-oh, Kristian, that's not going to bode well for Pickle. Your dog's going to die. We just made logic there. We made reasoning. And all writing is good thinking. Good thinking equals good writing. So if we can get our students to capture their brilliant ideas brilliantly on paper, half the battle is won. So how do we morph this heuristic into something we could use for rhetorical analysis? Pretty easy. Premise one, it's going to be an argument containing terms, devices, techniques. Here's the kicker. If you explicitly stated the term up top in the thesis, you have to imply it. And then the same goes the other way. You can imply twice, but usually if you went implicit in the intro, you're going to go explicit in the first premise. Because you don't want to be reiterative. I always tell my students that repetition's the bane of the author's existence. So you don't want to repeat your sentence patterns. You don't want to repeat your language. Everything's got to be fresh and new. So there's a lot of math to a syllogism. And the first premise, which I'm going to model for you in just a second, is 3 sentences long, right? I want to make sure that the centrality of the kid's argument is there. And if you take 3 sentences, it prevents kids from doing plot analysis, which is not the demand of the assignment. We're doing rhetorical analysis. So if they take 3 sentences, they can keep that argument as the central focal point of the piece. In the 4th sentence, you want to introduce the textual support. So we know we got a quote, we got a paraphrase. So that's coming in the second premise. Body paragraphs need to be concluded. Often students will just run away. They'll drop a quote and then they'll run away. And it's like, no, get back here. You got to finish your thought. So this is where the textual analysis is going to come. One final piece of math. A syllogistic body paragraph is going to be 10 to 12 sentences. And I know what you're thinking. Oh my God, Kristian, this essay is going to be gargantuan. Well, this is the reason why on the AP exam for both AP Language and AP Lit, my students only write 4 paragraphs, intro, 2 bodies, and a conclusion. And that's all you need. I know there's a lot of teachers that insist that it has to be 5 paragraphs. Absolute mythology. It doesn't need to be that way. If you're writing like 4 or 5 sentence bagger paragraphs, yeah, you're probably going to need that extra paragraph. But really in that space, you're not going to have the support and analysis you need to fully flesh out an idea. So I think that 10 to 12 paradigm works best. So let's ask ourselves a question. What's a first premise look like? I got you covered. Here it is. Students often ask me, Mr. Kuhn, where do I begin my analysis? And I say, why don't you begin right where Kermit begins? Have like a methodological approach. Go chronologically. Go sequentially through the text. Go in order. So we use a stem, and it's really simple. We say right from the onset, comma. It cues the reader into knowing that you have a sequence, that you have a methodological approach to this, that you're going to be really organized and have a nice tight line of reasoning. So my students typically will begin the first body paragraph with right from the onset. So look how I wield this here. Right from the onset, Kermit's inherent innocence witnesses him deviating from the typical commencement motifs. Often leading his remarks with interjections and exclamatory statements, he announces that he's merely a frog caught in the specter of the brilliant spotlight that shines down upon all the attendees. True to his long-established persona as a humorous and beloved children's character, he's intent on not breaking form. All right. I tell this to my students all the time. Your first premise is a promise. And you got to multitask here because I want to get kids away from writing 1 paragraph tone, 1 paragraph diction, 1 paragraph syntax. Like that's not college writing. And that's not going to bode well come exam time. So they got to be able to see how the terms, devices, and techniques interlock and interface with each other. So you can see here that, again, you have multiple implied or explicit terms that kind of front load the topic sentences of the body paragraph. So if we read this, it says, right from the onset, Kermit's inherent innocence witnesses him deviating from the typical commencement motifs. If we articulate that as a promise, what that now means is that I need a quote and or a paraphrase from up top the passage that gets at the motifs of a commencement address, but also the ethos of Kermit. So sit tight, because in my fourth sentence, I'm going to do that. Often leading his remarks with interjections and exclamatory statements. So now I need to quote and or paraphrase that, right? Do some syntactical analysis. He announces that he's merely a frog caught in the specter of the brilliant spotlight that shines down upon all the attendees. True to his long-established persona as a humorous and beloved children's character, so that sets me up for ethos, pathos, and tone. He's intent on not breaking form, right? So I got a lot to do, and this is why you need 10 to 12 sentences, right? So those first 3 sentences set that up. So let's talk about transitioning to the second premise. So this is where students begin to quote and or paraphrase. You have to hold true to the promise of the first premise and cherry pick your quotes and paraphrases accordingly, and that will absolutely lock in the line of reasoning. So I always tell my kids, go quote hunting, write your first premise, stop, get into the text, and look at exactly which quotes you need for your support and analysis. So here we go. Let's take a look at the fourth sentence here where the second premise is introduced. Immediately, he punctuates his speech with the childlike whims of exclaiming, "Wow, wow," as he even remembers to not forget the summer class of 2024 and the winter class of 2024. Even though these former classes had their own ceremonies some months ago, his innocence begs the question. Yeah, oh, did he leave anybody out? So let's talk about the quote transitions here. I have a video, and I'm going to link to it in the description down below, that goes over quote transitions and embedding quotes. So I teach my kids something called the 5-word rule. If they place a minimum of 5 words in front of the quote and keep the quote relatively small, it should sound conversational. But I always want to teach my kids how to set themselves up to get the sophistication point. And if you notice in that first quote there that I used ellipses, and that there are multiple quotes in one sentence, right? You actually got 2 quotes in one sentence. That's something kids will not do on their own unless it's explicitly taught. And that's really advanced embedding there. I really, really like it when students can do that. You also have to teach kids how to bracket so that they keep their tenses consistent and make sure that the quotes are sounding conversational. So whenever you quote, you got to make sure that you analyze. So let's continue here. Deliberately unpolished and extemporaneous in nature, stripped of the typical academic refinements and structures, Kermit even doubles his diction as a child might in moments of sheer excitement. With the breathlessness of wonderment, he exclaims that you are all here, to the captivation of a frog in a very tiny cap and gown on a beautiful evening in which he guarantees a forecast calling for a 100% chance of fraud. So early in the year, I want to show my students how to do those multi-layered quotes in one sentence. I probably overdid it there. I definitely overdid it there. So I'm just modeling, just demonstrating for students how to do that. You know, every quote, you don't want to do that, but oftentimes students will quote and then they're done with the quote and they drop their period. And they do that every single time. That's not sophisticated. So in the description below, I go over 4 quote frames that I'm going to go over with my students during this exercise, just to make sure that they're embedding with some level of sophistication and pizzazz. So we quote, we got to go on here. We got to analyze. But not being totally oblivious to the constructive scaffold of typical commencement addresses, he makes certain to acknowledge some of the university dignitaries who are present, right? So I want to show my kids too, you don't have to quote everything. I think sometimes kids overquote. You know, I could have quoted that line, but what would it add, right? It wouldn't really add anything dynamic to my analysis. So just paraphrase there. You can see the little continued icon on the bottom there. I'm out of space. The paragraph continues on the next slide. And yet, like a frog well-versed in the telling of dad jokes, he gives a nod of the head and a wink of his fellow amphibians who have all worked their tails off, just like himself, a former tadpole, now of the age of maturity. After a third of his address has been delivered, he finally launches into his exigence to share some words of wisdom about three things that are close to his heart: finding your people, taking the leap, making connections, right? So I've set myself up for my next body paragraph. In this, the main thing is the enumerated structure of the piece. Like, you got to absolutely talk about that, which we'll look at in the next paragraph. But I got to conclude this syllogism. You can't end on a quote. So look at how this comes full circle. Conclusions usually take about 2 sentences. This enumerated structure allows Kermit to spell out his principal message, that his life's trajectory actually mirrors the journey ahead that lies at the tips of the graduate's inevitable footsteps. All these alums need to do is take to heart these 3 tokens of wisdom, and they will be prepared to go merrily upon their ways into this thing called adult life. And again, that takes about 12 sentences, right? So intro's done, body paragraph's done. We have to ask ourselves the question, what do I do next? And here's where the beauty of heuristics comes into play. All you do is bust out another syllogism. You follow the formula, you follow the frame to the T. You look at where you're at in your analysis because you're going chronologically through it. Assess what terms, devices, techniques are left, and then you just hammer it home. So let's take a look at a first premise that would set us up for that. As the speech continues, Kermit makes certain to acknowledge his parent, Jim Henson, something the student should likewise do, because it is the parents in the audience who laid the seeds for the 3 points of wisdom. So I'm setting myself up to dissect the 3 points in the enumerated structure. Continuing with his established ethos and amphibious puns, so there's a lot of that in this, so I got to keep going, right? Kermit expounds upon each point with humor and wit. So there's still a lot more pathos that I have to do. So then second premise begins fourth sentence, just like the first time we did this. And I'm going to set myself up for the quote. So look where I go. Touching upon the first point, he suggests that first premise is a promise. What was my first point? I got to talk about Jim Henson. I got to go get a Jim Henson quote. So I'm going to stop this syllogism right here, because what I do in my class is my students steal this and then they write the rest of the syllogism. They just practice. So I really want to emphasize the promise of the first premise and aligning those quotes, and then experimenting with the embedded quote frames and the 5-word rule. So they'll rock and roll the rest of this. Typically they struggle a little bit because it's early in the year, but hey, that's cool. That's called learning. That's why we're here, and that's why we get the big bucks. So in terms of how I would do this, I would have them write down exactly what you see on this screen, and then I would advise, just like we did the first time, go hunt some textual support. What quotes and or paraphrases do we need to flesh out this syllogism? All right. And then the second body paragraph will be done, which brings us to the conclusion. How do you wrap it up? How do you tag a conclusion to this? Early in the year, I used conclusion stems, and I used the following analogy. So conclusions of essays are kind of like the grand finale of a fireworks display. They're all encapsulating, all encompassing. So if you lead with statements like simply said, evidentially, and no other words, when it's all said and done, at the end of the day, usually you're keying your reader into the idea that you're going to have a big moment of exigence here. So let's see one in its entirety. At the end of the day, a frog's life is really no different from that of these graduates. Just so long as one chooses their company wisely, has faith, and works with collaborative smarts, so I'm back into that enumeration there, the path should be smooth sailing. Going contrary to these principles, so it seems, will most likely find the alum stuck in the proverbial muck and mire of the pond life. So I ended with a frog pun myself, right? Add a little wit and humor to it. And that's something that I teach my students too, because that sophistication point is hard to get in AP Lang. And you got to be able to have some spunk and personality to your writing. And that conclusion right there is something where if I'm on the cusp of a 5 and a 6, I think a reader might read that and say, oh, that's a really good writing strategy right there. I'm going to give this kid the 6, right? And it tends to work. So you got to have conclusions like that. I'm at the end. If you have any comments, questions, concerns, or if you want copies of these slides, so exactly what you saw in this presentation, I have a PDF. You can email me for free, no gimmicks. I'm not going to sell you anything. Write at ivywrite@gmail.com. I'm happy to share, and I really love it when teachers write me back and say that they're using my heuristics. I mean, it's really cool to have YouTube channels and be in classrooms having impact. I don't know, that touches my soul. I like that. It's a good life feeling. So also note that I have my own tutoring company called Write at Ivy Write. And it might sound strange, but I do tutor teachers. So I'm a lead teacher for the National Writing Project. So if you want to shore up how to do the compositional aspect of your craft, I might be the guy. So I've been doing this a long time, written textbooks, presented for NCTE a couple of times, and been doing this many, many, many years. So if you would like to learn these heuristics and learn some really good writing strategies like my Word Study Academy, my Nuanced Academy, all those little tricks and compositional flares, you can visit my webpage at writeativywrite.com. I do have a self-paced course because I know that teachers' lives are very busy, and a lot of teachers have worked their way through that self-paced course and they love it. It's pretty rich. It's packed with resources. I also tutor students, and I do AP Lit, AP Lang, general composition. The big thing I do, though, that I'm most known for is the college personal statement, getting kids through that college application. So I have a bunch of videos in the YouTube channel centering around that. We are coming upon personal statement season. So if you have students or kids of your own that would like to work with me, check it out, writeativywrite.com, or drop me an email and we could hop on a Zoom call to learn more. Writeativywrite@gmail.com. That's it for now. I'll keep them coming.